What happens when cocky MMA fighters step into the wrong ring and meet a WWE superstar who's had enough of their trash talk? We've seen MMA fighters call wrestlers fake, but what happens when those words lead to a real fight? From Brock Lesnar breaking egos to Bobby Lashley making a statement, this video exposes the moments when WWE power met MMA pride, and chaos followed. Get ready to relive brutal knockouts, unexpected comebacks, and pure savage chaos. These aren't staged slaps. These are the moments that made MMA fighters think twice before mocking a WWE star again. If you love seeing egos shattered and fighters humbled, make sure to like, subscribe, and stick around. Because this is one battle you won't believe until you see it. WWE stars who stepped into MMA brought real wrestling power, unmatched discipline, and the kind of grit you only see from people who've been through thousands of grueling matches. Let's start with one of the most dominant crossovers ever, Bobby Lashley. Lashley didn't just talk the talk. He walked into MMA cages where guys laughed at him for being a fake wrestler. One of them was Mike Cook, an MMA fighter who decided to mock Bobby before the fight. Full-on clowning, fake wrestling entrance, the whole deal. But once the bell rang, the jokes ended. Lashley went in like a machine, slammed Cook to the mat, and locked in a choke so tight the fight ended in under 10 seconds. The crowd couldn't believe it. The so-called pro wrestler just choked out a real MMA fighter in record time. And Lashley didn't stop there. In Bellator, he went toe-to-toe with heavyweight monsters like Bob Sapp and James Thompson, guys who were supposed to be too big and too mean to handle. But Lashley was on a mission. Against Sapp, he shot for a takedown, dragged the 350-pounder to the canvas like it was nothing, and pounded him until Sapp had to tap. Years later, he faced Thompson again, the same fighter who once got a lucky decision win over him. This time, Lashley dominated. Lightning-fast takedowns, heavy hands, brutal ground, and pound. The referee had no choice but to step in. It wasn't just a win, it was redemption. Then came Ken Shamrock, one of the pioneers who made it clear that wrestlers can thrive in MMA. In his prime, Shamrock wasn't facing actors, he was facing real killers in the cage. One night, he took on a 380-pound brawler named The Grizzly. Everyone thought the weight difference would crush him. Instead, Shamrock outclassed the big man, transitioned beautifully, and forced him to tap in the first round with an armbar. The message was loud and clear: technique beats size, especially when that technique comes from a wrestling base. And who could forget Dave Bautista? The Animal himself stepped into the cage after years of WWE stardom. His opponent, a veteran MMA fighter, came in cocky, taunting, smirking, thinking he'd expose another entertainer. But once Bautista started throwing those heavy punches and ground strikes, the whole energy changed. He took the guy down, unloaded a storm of punches, and won by TKO. He may not have had the longest MMA career, but in that one night, he proved he wasn't just muscle, he was a fighter. Jake Hager, known to WWE fans as Jack Swagger, carried his NCAA wrestling pedigree into the cage, and it showed. Every time an opponent tried to stand and trade, Hager would time it perfectly, shoot for the takedown, and finish the job. His opponents came in cocky, thinking he'd fade. Instead, they ended up tapping out or eating ground and pound they couldn't escape. So yes, WWE stars did beat trained MMA fighters. They didn't just survive, they dominated. What makes it even crazier is how disciplined these athletes are. They understand showmanship, but behind that persona is a lifetime of training, conditioning, and real combat experience. When these wrestlers crossed into MMA, they didn't bring scripts. They brought strength, speed, and the mindset of champions. And when that cage door closed, it was pure chaos, not the kind you rehearse, the kind that leaves even seasoned MMA fighters wondering. How did a pro wrestler just do that? Bobby Lashley, Ken Shamrock, Batista, Jake Hager, they all proved they could step into the cage and win for real. But that raises the next big question a lot of people still ask. Were these fights real or scripted? Let's clear that up. These weren't storylines. There were no scripts and no safety nets. Once that cage door shut, it was as real as it gets. These guys weren't playing characters. They were fighting trained professionals trying to take their heads off. Take Bobby Lashley's Bellator debut. No lights, no flashy promos, just two men trying to knock each other out. Lashley used his world-class wrestling, slammed his opponent down, and locked in a rear naked choke until there was no choice but to tap. The sound of the cage, the sweat, the breathing, all of it was raw and real. You could see it in his face. He wasn't performing for fans, he was fighting for respect. Same with Dave Bautista. When he made his MMA debut, people thought it was a publicity stunt. But once the punches started flying, all that talk disappeared. He got cracked early, adjusted, landed clean shots, and turned the fight around. The adrenaline, the heavy breathing, that wasn't acting. When his opponent dropped and the ref stepped in, the relief on Batista's face said it all. That was a man who'd just been through a real war. And Ken Shamrock? He's the perfect example of someone who lived both sides, the WWE stage and the MMA cage. Back in the early days of the UFC, before gloves and rules, Shamrock was fighting bare knuckle against men twice his size. No scripts, no cameras directing the action, just survival. When he transitioned back to pro wrestling, he brought that intensity with him, which is why his matches felt so real. Jake Hager's fights tell the same story. Sure, he came from a wrestling background, but in Bellator, there's no pretending. His opponents were legit fighters, some with years of cage experience. When Hager locked in that arm triangle and his opponent refused to tap, you could see the real struggle. Veins popping, arms trembling, and when he finally let go, you could tell that hold wasn't a stunt. It was pure strength and control. Now, to be fair, the line between wrestling and MMA can get blurry. Some fights had showmanship, walkouts, stare-downs, trash talk, but once the bell rang, that entertainment energy turned into something primal. Every punch thrown, every takedown landed. That was real risk, real damage. So when fans ask, were those fights real? The answer is simple. Absolutely. WWE stars might know how to put on a show, but inside an MMA cage, there's no choreography. Every bruise, every submission, every knockout you've seen in those fights, that's all real pain and real power. And the wildest part? Many of those MMA fighters walked in thinking they were facing actors, but they walked out knowing they'd just gone toe-to-toe with some of the toughest, most disciplined athletes alive. You might think MMA fighters had the upper hand. After all, they live and breathe combat. But what most people forget is that many WWE stars started out as real wrestlers, Olympic level, NCAA champions, or submission specialists. When they entered the cage, they weren't actors pretending to fight. They were trained competitors stepping back into a familiar kind of war. Let's start again with Bobby Lashley, because he's the perfect example. The man didn't just win fights, he controlled them. Against opponents like James Thompson and Bob Sapp, Lashley showed the same explosiveness we saw in WWE, but this time it was backed by raw wrestling dominance. His takedowns looked effortless, and his ground game was smothering. Every round he fought, you could see the other guy break a little more. He wasn't chasing clout, he was earning respect one punch at a time. Then there's Ken Shamrock, the original crossover beast. Before the lights, before the pyro, he was already known as the world's most dangerous man. In early MMA, when rules were almost non-existent, Shamrock made his name by fighting monsters. Bare knuckle, no gloves, no mercy. He tapped out giants and struck fear into anyone across the cage. Even when he transitioned back into WWE, people still saw him as legit. When it comes to the question of who came out on top, Ken proved wrestlers could dominate the fight world before it was even cool. Brock Lesnar deserves a special mention here. He didn't just compete in the UFC, he won the heavyweight title. That's not a small thing. He went from pro wrestling to beating elite MMA fighters like Randy Couture and Shane Carwin. His strength, speed, and ground control were off the charts. Lesnar wasn't just surviving in MMA, he was redefining what a crossover athlete could do. And let's not forget Jake Hager, who's been quietly stacking wins in Bellator. Every time someone doubts him, he steps in, drags his opponent down, and makes them tap or quit. Hager doesn't just use brute force. He uses smart wrestling pressure, wearing his opponents down mentally before breaking them physically. Dave Bautista may have only had one fight, but that single night told you everything you needed to know. His opponent underestimated him, came in cocky, and paid for it. Bautista adjusted mid-fight, stayed calm under pressure, and turned it into a brawl he controlled from start to finish. Not bad for a guy everyone thought was just an actor. So, who came out on top? The answer's clear. The wrestlers did, not because of luck or because their opponents weren't skilled, but because of mindset. Wrestlers are built to grind, to adapt, and to dominate when things get tough. They train to control space, stay calm under pressure, and find a way to win no matter what. In the cage, that mentality is everything. When MMA fighters underestimated them, they paid for it. And when those WWE stars got hit, slammed, or cut open, they didn't crumble. They fought back harder. At the end of the day, these matches weren't just about wrestling versus MMA. They were about respect. And every time a so-called fake fighter stepped into that cage and came out with their hand raised, that respect was earned the real way. So yeah, the wrestlers came out on top, not just in wins, but in proving something bigger. That toughness isn't scripted, and there it is. The truth hits harder than a steel chair. The so-called fake fighters walked into a real cage and showed the world who the real alphas are. When the lights dimmed and the cage door shut, all the talk, all the egos, all the doubts disappeared. What was left were men like Bobby Lashley, Ken Shamrock, Brock Lesnar, Dave Bautista, and Jake Hager, standing tall, bloodied, but victorious. That's the ultimate payout, seeing pure dominance when no one expected it. Lashley turned mockery into silence. Lesnar stormed through the UFC ranks and made history. Shamrock proved it decades earlier when MMA was still the Wild West. Hager carried that torch with quiet destruction inside Bellator. And Batista, he walked into the cage with the weight of doubt and walked out with the respect of every fighter watching. It's not about which sport is tougher. It's about grit, the kind that doesn't quit when you're cornered. These wrestlers didn't just win fights. They won back respect for an entire profession. They erased that tired idea that wrestling is fake, because nothing about what they did in those cages was fake. Every bruise, every choke, every knockout, that was real. And that's the beauty of it, watching arrogance get shattered by hard work and pride get punished by discipline. So, if you're someone who's ever doubted what these athletes can really do, think again. Hit that like button if you respect the grind. Drop a comment with your favorite WWE crossover fight, and subscribe if you want more raw stories where ego meets reality and power speaks for itself. This is more than just fights. It's the collision of two worlds where only the toughest survive. And if you've made it this far, you already know who those are.